What medical emergency did your parents refuse to believe was real? My mother made me eat peanut butter sandwiches every single day for lunch starting the week I turned 12. Not because I liked them, but because she'd decided my recent complaints about feeling sick after eating trail mix were psychological weakness that needed to be conquered through exposure. She'd read some article online about how modern parents were creating allergic children through overprotection and fear-mongering, and she became obsessed with proving that allergies were manufactured conditions existing only in the minds of weak-willed people who'd been coddled into hypochondria. She announced at dinner one Sunday that our family would no longer acknowledge or accommodate any claimed food sensitivities, because doing so would only reinforce imaginary limitations. The trail mix incident had happened 3 weeks earlier at school. I'd eaten some from a bag my friend Olivia shared during lunch, and within 20 minutes my mouth felt strange and tingly, like I'd burned it on hot soup. My tongue started swelling slightly, and I felt nauseous enough to visit the school nurse, who gave me Benadryl and called my mother to pick me up early. Mom arrived irritated that her workday had been interrupted for what she deemed dramatic attention-seeking. She lectured me the entire drive home about the power of suggestion and how reading food labels created psychosomatic reactions in suggestible minds. When I tried explaining that the tingling and swelling were real physical sensations, she cut me off and said that was exactly how the mind manifested imaginary problems into physical symptoms. My father stayed silent during these lectures, which was his standard response to most family conflicts. He worked long hours as an accountant and seemed to view parenting as something that happened around him rather than something requiring his active participation. When Mom announced her new policy about food sensitivities, Dad just nodded and went back to reading his newspaper. My 8-year-old brother Felix looked between us with worried eyes but didn't say anything either. We'd all learned that disagreeing with Mom when she latched onto an idea only made things worse. The peanut butter sandwich protocol started the next Monday. Mom made my lunch every morning before work. Always the same thing. 2 thick slices of whole wheat bread with a generous layer of natural peanut butter, an apple, and a bottle of water. She watched me pack it into my lunch bag each morning, explaining that consistency was important for retraining my mind to understand that peanuts were harmless protein sources, not threats. I tried arguing that maybe I should just avoid peanuts if they made me feel sick, but she called that defeatist thinking. She said humans had eaten nuts for thousands of years, and only in the last generation had this allergy epidemic appeared, which proved it was psychological rather than biological. The first sandwich made my mouth tingle within 3 bites. I threw most of it away and bought chips from the vending machine instead, using money I'd saved from my allowance. That evening, Mom asked how lunch went, and I lied, saying it was fine. I didn't want another lecture about weakness and manufactured illnesses. She seemed pleased and said we'd continue the protocol until my mind learned that peanuts posed no threat. I nodded and excused myself to do homework, my stomach churning with anxiety about the next day's lunch. I managed to avoid eating the sandwiches for almost 2 weeks by throwing them away and buying alternative lunches. But Mom checked my account balance when she added my monthly allowance and noticed I'd been spending money at school. She asked what I was buying, and I stammered something about snacks and school supplies. She pulled up the cafeteria purchase history online and saw the pattern of chip and pretzel purchases during lunch periods. Her expression hardened, and she asked directly if I'd been eating the sandwiches she made. I hesitated too long before answering, and she knew. The confrontation happened that evening after dinner. Mom called a family meeting in the living room and announced that I'd been deceiving her about eating the peanut butter sandwiches, wasting food, and wasting money to reinforce my psychosomatic condition. She said this behavior demonstrated exactly the kind of weakness she'd been trying to eliminate, and clearly, a new approach was needed. From now on, she would supervise my lunch consumption directly. She'd arranged with my school principal to take her lunch break at the same time as my lunch period, and she'd eat with me in the cafeteria to ensure I consumed the entire sandwich while she watched. My stomach dropped at this announcement. Having my mother supervise my lunch like I was a toddler who couldn't be trusted would be humiliating in front of my classmates. Felix looked at me with sympathy, but said nothing. Dad made a small sound that might have been objection, but when Mom turned to look at him, he went quiet and stared at his hands. She continued explaining that this intervention was necessary because I'd proven I couldn't be trusted to follow through on my own, and enabling my avoidance would only deepen my psychological dependence on imaginary limitations. The supervised lunches started the next day. Mom arrived at the cafeteria at noon with her own lunch and sat across from me at my usual table. My friends scattered to other tables, clearly uncomfortable with a parent's presence. Mom unpacked my lunch and set the peanut butter sandwich in front of me, then opened her own salad and began eating while watching me expectantly. I picked up the sandwich with shaking hands, my throat already feeling tight with anxiety. The first bite made my mouth tingle immediately, that same burning sensation from the trail mix incident but more intense. I tried to tell Mom my mouth felt strange, but she cut me off and said that was my mind creating symptoms, because I expected them. She instructed me to take another bite and focus on breathing calmly, instead of manufacturing panic. I took a second bite, and the tingling spread to my lips and tongue, which started feeling swollen and strange. My throat felt scratchy and uncomfortable. I set the sandwich down and said I really didn't feel well, that something was wrong. Mom's expression hardened and she told me to stop performing and finish eating. When I hesitated, she leaned forward and said in a low, firm voice that I would eat every bite of that sandwich, or she'd make me eat 2 sandwiches tomorrow while she watched. I forced myself to keep eating despite the growing discomfort in my mouth and throat. By the 4th bite, my tongue felt genuinely swollen, and my breathing seemed slightly harder than normal. I started to panic, which Mom immediately seized on as proof of psychological reaction. She told me to calm down, that my breathing was fine and I was working myself into hysteria. She made me finish the entire sandwich while she sat there watching with this satisfied expression like she was winning some battle against modern parenting weakness. When lunch ended, I felt sick and shaky, but Mom seemed pleased with herself as she walked me to my next class. That afternoon, I developed hives on my arms and chest. The school nurse noticed them during gym class and sent me to her office. She asked what I'd eaten for lunch, and when I told her about the peanut butter sandwich, her expression shifted to concern. She called my mother and suggested I might be developing a peanut allergy that needed medical evaluation. I could hear Mom's sharp voice through the phone, explaining that the school was enabling my psychosomatic behavior, and she wouldn't waste money on unnecessary medical tests for an imaginary condition. The nurse tried to argue that hives were an objective physical symptom, but Mom cut her off and said skin reactions could be caused by stress and anxiety, which I was clearly experiencing due to excessive accommodation of my fears. The nurse gave me Benadryl again and made detailed notes in my file. Before I left her office, she asked quietly if I felt safe at home. The question startled me. I nodded automatically, though I wasn't sure it was true. She made me promise to come see her immediately if I had any trouble breathing or if my throat felt swollen after eating. She wrote down symptoms of anaphylaxis on a card and made me keep it in my pocket. Her concern made me feel both validated and terrified. If a medical professional was worried, maybe my mother was wrong. But if my mother was wrong, that meant she was deliberately hurting me while believing she was helping, which was somehow more frightening than the physical symptoms. The supervised lunches continued for another week. Each day, the reactions got slightly worse. The tingling in my mouth intensified. My tongue and lips swelled more noticeably. The hives spread across my torso and arms. My throat felt scratchy and uncomfortable for hours after lunch. But Mom remained convinced these were psychosomatic manifestations that would disappear once my mind accepted that peanuts weren't dangerous. She started documenting my reactions in a notebook, describing them as behavioral performances rather than medical symptoms. She'd write things like excessive theatrical displays of discomfort and manipulative breathing patterns designed to elicit attention. Felix started having nightmares. He'd wake up crying in the middle of the night, and when Mom asked what was wrong, he'd say he dreamed I couldn't breathe. She told him he was being dramatic like his sister and sent him back to bed. But during the day, Felix started following me around the house with worried eyes. He asked me once if I was okay, and I lied and said yes because I didn't want him to worry more. He was 8 years old and already understood that disagreeing with Mom about my situation would only cause problems. The helplessness in his face haunted me. Dad's role in all this was absence disguised as neutrality. He went to work early and came home late. When he was home, he retreated to his office or the garage. The few times I tried to tell him I was genuinely scared about the reactions I was having, he'd pat my shoulder awkwardly and say Mom knew best about these things since she'd researched it so thoroughly. He seemed to believe that his lack of medical knowledge excused him from having an opinion, which really meant he was choosing not to protect me because protecting me would require confronting Mom. The crisis happened 3 weeks into the peanut butter protocol, during a family dinner on a Friday night. Mom had made chicken stir-fry with a peanut sauce, announcing proudly that she was expanding my exposure therapy beyond just sandwiches. I stared at my plate with growing dread, knowing that eating this would trigger worse reactions than the sandwiches had. I tried to politely decline, saying I wasn't very hungry, but Mom's expression went cold. She said I would eat what was served and she wouldn't tolerate any more manipulation or avoidance. I took a small bite of chicken covered in the peanut sauce. The tingling started immediately, more intense than ever before. My mouth and throat began feeling strange and tight. I set down my fork and said I really couldn't eat this. Something was wrong. Mom slammed her own fork down and accused me of being deliberately dramatic to avoid confronting my psychological issues. She said I would sit at that table until I cleaned my plate, even if it took all night. Dad looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Felix stared at his own plate, fork frozen halfway to his mouth. I forced down another bite, then another, my throat getting progressively tighter and more uncomfortable. Breathing started feeling difficult, like sucking air through a narrow straw. My chest felt heavy and strange. Hives erupted across my arms and neck. I stood up from the table, genuinely panicking now, and tried to tell Mom I couldn't breathe properly. She stood up too and accused me of performing, of putting on a show for attention. Her face was flushed with anger, and something that looked like desperation, like she needed me to be faking this because the alternative meant admitting she'd been wrong. My breathing got rapidly worse. I was wheezing now, each breath a struggle. My throat felt like it was closing. I grabbed at my neck, terrified, and tried to tell them I needed help. Mom screamed that I was being theatrical and demanded I sit back down and finish eating. The room started spinning. I couldn't get enough air. My vision went spotty around the edges. I heard Felix crying, his voice high and panicked, begging Mom to call 911. She yelled at him to be quiet and stop feeding into my manipulation. That's when Felix did something that probably saved my life. He ran from the table and bolted out the front door, heading toward our neighbor's house. Mom ran after him, shouting for him to come back immediately. I collapsed onto the dining room floor, my airway so constricted I could barely pull in any oxygen at all. Dad finally moved, kneeling beside me with his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. His voice cracked as he told the operator his daughter was having some kind of allergic reaction and couldn't breathe. Through my fading consciousness, I heard Mom yelling outside and Felix screaming for help. Our neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, appeared in the doorway moments later with Felix clinging to her side. She took one look at me on the floor and immediately asked Dad if I'd been given an EpiPen. He stared at her blankly, not understanding the question. Mrs. Alvarez cursed under her breath and told him she'd be right back. She ran to her own house and returned 30 seconds later with an epinephrine auto-injector. She didn't hesitate, jamming it into my thigh through my jeans and holding it there while the medication discharged. Mom was screaming in the background about Mrs. Alvarez overstepping and interfering with family matters, but Mrs. Alvarez ignored her completely. The epinephrine hit my system like a lightning bolt. My throat started opening up almost immediately, air rushing back into my lungs in painful, desperate gasps. Mrs. Alvarez kept her hand on my shoulder, telling me to breathe slowly and evenly, that the paramedics were coming and I was going to be okay. My heart was racing from the epinephrine, pounding so hard I could feel it in my skull, but I could breathe again. The relief was overwhelming. I started crying from fear and gratitude, and the adrenaline coursing through my system. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. They immediately started assessing my condition, checking my vitals and oxygen levels, asking what I'd eaten and what symptoms I'd experienced. Mom tried to intervene, insisting this was all psychological and they were reinforcing my attention-seeking behavior by treating it as a medical emergency. One of the paramedics, a woman named Gloria, turned to my mother with an expression of barely controlled fury. She said my oxygen saturation had been dangerously low, and I'd been in full anaphylactic shock when they arrived. This wasn't psychological. This was a life-threatening allergic reaction that required immediate medical intervention. Mom's face went through several expressions: confusion, denial, anger, and something that might have been fear. She tried to argue, pulling out her notebook full of documentation about my supposed behavioral issues. Gloria looked at the notebook, reading passages where Mom described my reactions as performances and manipulations. Her expression hardened further. She told Mom that documenting a child's allergic reactions as behavioral problems while continuing to force exposure to allergens was medical neglect at minimum, possibly abuse. She said the hospital would be filing a mandatory report with Child Protective Services. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of continued treatment and monitoring. They gave me additional medications to prevent a secondary reaction and kept me on oxygen. Felix rode in the ambulance with me, holding my hand tightly and crying quietly. The paramedic assigned to monitor me asked him gently how long this had been going on. Felix's voice was small and scared as he explained about the peanut butter sandwiches and supervised lunches and Mom's insistence that allergies weren't real. The paramedic took notes while maintaining a carefully neutral expression, but I could see anger tightening her jaw. At the hospital, I was taken immediately to the emergency department while Felix was sent to a waiting area with a social worker. A team of doctors and nurses surrounded me, continuing treatment and running tests. An allergist was called in to assess my condition. She asked detailed questions about when my symptoms had started, what I'd been exposed to, and how my mother had responded. I told her everything, too exhausted and scared to lie or downplay any of it. The allergist's expression grew increasingly grim as I described the weeks of forced peanut exposure and my mother's insistence that my reactions were psychological. The allergist ordered comprehensive allergy testing despite my mother's protests from outside the treatment area. The tests came back showing severe allergy to peanuts and tree nuts, along with moderate allergies to several other foods. The allergist explained that I'd likely developed the peanut allergy recently, as sometimes happens during adolescence, and that continuing to force exposure after symptoms appeared had been incredibly dangerous. Each exposure had sensitized my immune system further, making subsequent reactions worse. Tonight's reaction could have been fatal if Felix hadn't gotten help when he did. A woman from Child Protective Services arrived around midnight. Her name was Patricia, and she had kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. She interviewed me privately, asking about the peanut butter protocol, my mother's beliefs about allergies, and whether I'd ever been denied medical care for other conditions. I explained everything as clearly as I could, my voice hoarse from the throat swelling. Patricia took detailed notes and assured me that she would investigate thoroughly. She asked about Felix and whether he was safe at home. I told her Felix had saved my life tonight by running for help, and I was terrified what Mom might do to him for disobeying her. Patricia went to interview Felix next, and I could hear his small voice through the wall describing how scared he'd been watching me struggle to breathe. He told Patricia about his nightmares and how Mom had called him dramatic for worrying about me. He described how Dad never intervened or disagreed with Mom about anything. Patricia spent over an hour with Felix, gentle and patient as he shared his fears and observations. When she finally emerged, her expression was set and determined. She told the hospital staff she was placing both Felix and me in emergency protective custody pending investigation. Mom exploded when she heard this decision. Her voice carried through the emergency department as she screamed about her rights as a parent and how the state had no authority to separate her from her children. Patricia remained calm and professional, explaining that forcing a child to consume a known allergen despite medical evidence of severe reactions constituted medical neglect and endangered my life. Until CPS completed their investigation, Felix and I would be placed in foster care. Security was called when Mom tried to physically prevent Patricia from leaving with Felix. Dad stood by helplessly, looking defeated and lost. We spent that night in emergency foster care with a couple named Denise and Malcolm, who specialized in crisis placements. Their house was quiet and comfortable, with a spare bedroom that Felix and I shared. Felix crawled into bed with me around 2 a.m, shaking and crying. He kept apologizing for getting me taken away from home. I held him and told him he'd saved my life, and I was so proud of how brave he'd been. He fell asleep eventually, curled against my side, while I stared at the ceiling processing everything that had happened. The next morning, Denise made breakfast and asked carefully if there were any foods we couldn't eat. I listed my allergies based on what the hospital had told me, and she wrote everything down. She promised that nothing in this house would make me sick, and that my medical needs would be taken seriously here. The relief I felt at those simple words made me start crying. Denise hugged me and said I was safe now, and nobody would force me to eat anything dangerous. Malcolm sat with Felix at the table, teaching him a card game to distract him from the stress of the situation. Patricia visited later that day to check on us and explain the investigation process. She'd already interviewed the school nurse, who provided detailed documentation of my repeated allergic reactions and my mother's refusal to seek medical evaluation. She'd interviewed Mrs. Alvarez, who described Felix's panicked state when he ran to her house and my mother's angry response to her intervention. She'd reviewed the notebook my mother had been keeping, which contained months of documented allergic reactions described as behavioral problems. The evidence was extensive and damning. The investigation expanded when Patricia interviewed my primary care doctor, who reported that my mother had canceled multiple appointments over the past year when the doctor wanted to discuss my symptoms and run allergy tests. Mom had told the doctor's office that we were seeking alternative medicine approaches and wouldn't be returning. The doctor had made notes expressing concern about medical neglect, but hadn't filed a formal report. She admitted to Patricia that she regretted not pushing harder to intervene, especially after reviewing the hospital records from my anaphylactic reaction. Patricia also discovered that Mom had been active in several online groups dedicated to allergy denialism, communities of parents who believed food allergies were manufactured by pharmaceutical companies to sell expensive medications like EpiPens. Mom had posted extensively about her plan to cure my psychological food sensitivity through forced exposure therapy. Other group members had encouraged this approach, sharing their own stories of refusing to accommodate their children's claimed allergies. Patricia was working with law enforcement to investigate other families in these groups for potential child endangerment. The court hearing happened 5 days after my hospitalization. A judge reviewed the evidence Patricia had compiled, medical records documenting my severe allergy, the notebook full of my mother's observations describing genuine allergic reactions as behavioral performances, testimony from the school nurse and doctor about canceled appointments and refused interventions, statements from the paramedics about my near-death condition, and screenshots of Mom's posts in the allergy denialism groups. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as each piece of evidence was presented. Mom's lawyer tried to argue that she genuinely believed allergies were psychological and had been trying to help me overcome an imaginary limitation. The judge cut him off and said that a parent's sincere belief in pseudoscience didn't excuse medical neglect, especially when medical professionals had repeatedly tried to intervene and been refused. He noted that Mom had continued forcing peanut exposure even after I developed documented allergic reactions, and her insistence on supervised lunches showed deliberate intent to ensure I consumed the allergen, rather than ignorance of the danger. Dad was also called to testify. He sat in the witness stand looking miserable and small, admitting he'd known I was having reactions to the peanut butter, but had deferred to Mom's judgment because she'd seemed so certain of her research. The judge asked him directly why he hadn't intervened when I was clearly suffering. Dad had no good answer. He mumbled something about not wanting to undermine Mom's parenting decisions and cause conflict in the marriage. The judge told him bluntly that his passivity had enabled abuse and endangered his children's lives. His silence had been complicity. Felix was interviewed by the judge in chambers with Patricia present. The judge was gentle with him, asking about his nightmares and his decision to run for help. Felix described watching me collapse and Mom refusing to call 911, how scared he'd been that I would die. He said he knew he'd get in trouble for disobeying and going to the neighbors, but he couldn't just watch me die. The judge told Felix he'd been incredibly brave and had done exactly the right thing. When Felix asked if Mom was mad at him, the judge said Felix's safety was the court's priority, not his mother's anger. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and severe. He found that both parents had engaged in medical neglect, with Mom as the primary perpetrator and Dad as an enabling accomplice through his failure to protect. Felix and I would remain in foster care until both parents completed extensive requirements including parenting classes, psychological evaluation, and supervised therapy. Mom would be required to complete additional education about allergies and medical compliance with a certified allergist. Neither parent would have unsupervised contact with us for a minimum of 6 months. Additionally, the judge ordered a criminal investigation into whether Mom's actions constituted felony child endangerment. He noted that forcing a child to consume a known allergen despite repeated medical evidence of severe reactions went beyond poor judgment into criminal territory. The prosecutor's office would review the case and decide whether to file charges. Mom started crying in the courtroom, but these tears looked more like self-pity than genuine remorse. She kept saying she'd only been trying to help me, that she'd thought she was making me stronger. Denise and Malcolm's home became our residence for the next 8 months. They were patient and kind, treating us like temporary family rather than obligations. Denise took me to follow-up appointments with the allergist, who prescribed 2 EpiPens that I was required to carry at all times. She taught me how to read labels carefully and advocate for my medical needs. The allergist was blunt about how serious my allergy was and how close I'd come to dying. She said that another exposure to peanuts without immediate epinephrine would likely be fatal. Felix thrived in the stability of Denise and Malcolm's house. His nightmares gradually decreased. He made friends at his new school and joined a soccer team. Malcolm taught him how to cook and do basic home repairs, father figure activities our actual father had never engaged in. Felix slowly stopped asking when we could go home and started calling Denise and Malcolm's house home instead. I felt guilty relief that he was healing in a way that suggested maybe we shouldn't go back. The supervised visits with our parents were awkward and tense. They happened twice a month at a CPS office with a social worker present. Mom spent the first several visits trying to justify her actions, insisting she'd been trying to help and had been misled by incorrect information online. The social worker had to remind her repeatedly that the visits were for rebuilding relationship with us, not defending herself. Eventually, Mom started focusing more on asking about school and our lives with Denise and Malcolm, though the conversations felt forced and uncomfortable. Dad was quiet during these visits, clearly unsure how to interact with us now that his passive approach had been exposed as harmful. He brought small gifts sometimes, books he thought I'd like, a soccer ball for Felix, but he seemed unable to have real conversations about what had happened or offer genuine apologies. Felix started refusing to engage with Dad after a few months, just sitting silently during visits until time was up. I tried to maintain some connection, but it felt like performing relationship with a stranger. The therapy sessions revealed deeper problems in our family system. Mom's obsession with strength and overcoming weakness came from her own childhood, with a father who'd called her weak for having asthma. She'd internalized his messages so deeply that when I developed a real medical condition, she couldn't separate it from her own childhood trauma. She saw my allergy as a manifestation of the weakness her father had accused her of possessing, and curing me became a way to retroactively prove her father wrong. The therapist pointed out that Mom had essentially been torturing me to resolve her own unresolved trauma. Dad's passivity was rooted in his own family history of conflict avoidance. His parents had fought constantly during his childhood, and he'd learned that staying quiet and invisible was the safest approach. He'd carried that pattern into his marriage, enabling Mom's harmful choices because confronting her would require the kind of conflict he'd spent his life avoiding. The therapist challenged him to understand that protecting his children required tolerating discomfort and standing up to harmful behavior, even when it meant conflict with his spouse. Felix's therapy sessions focused on helping him process the guilt he felt about getting help when Mom told him not to. He'd internalized the message that disobeying parents was always wrong, and he struggled with having been the one to bring outside intervention to our family. His therapist worked with him to understand that sometimes protecting someone you love means breaking rules, and that adults aren't always right even when they're confident. Felix slowly started accepting that he'd been brave rather than disobedient. My own therapy involved processing the medical trauma of repeated allergic reactions and the betrayal of having a parent deliberately cause them. I had nightmares about choking and not being able to breathe. I developed anxiety around mealtimes, even in safe environments, always worried that something would trigger a reaction. The therapist taught me grounding techniques and helped me rebuild trust in my own body's signals. She emphasized that my instinct that something was wrong had been correct, and learning to trust those instincts again was crucial for my safety. The criminal investigation concluded after 4 months. The prosecutor filed charges against Mom for felony child endangerment and reckless endangerment. The charges were based on her documented pattern of forcing peanut exposure despite medical evidence of severe allergic reactions, particularly the supervised lunches that showed deliberate intent to ensure consumption. Her posts in the allergy denialism groups served as evidence of premeditation. Dad wasn't charged criminally but faced potential civil liability for failure to protect. Mom's trial happened quickly. Her lawyer tried to mount a defense based on sincere belief in alternative medical theories, but the prosecution demolished this argument by showing that multiple medical professionals had attempted to intervene and been refused. They presented testimony from the allergist about how dangerous repeated exposures had been and how close I'd come to death. They showed the jury Mom's notebook describing my genuine medical symptoms as behavioral performances. They played a recording of Felix's 911 call to Mrs. Alvarez. His small voice panicked and terrified as he begged for help while Mom screamed in the background. The most damaging evidence was Mom's own testimony. She took the stand against her lawyer's advice and spent 3 hours defending her belief that allergies were psychological and explaining how she'd been trying to strengthen my character. She genuinely seemed to believe she'd been a good parent making tough choices to help me overcome weakness. The prosecutor asked her directly if she understood that her actions had nearly killed me. Mom hesitated, then said that if I died, it would have been from psychological weakness rather than peanuts, because the mind could create any physical reaction it believed in strongly enough. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Mom guilty on both felony counts. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. During that time, CPS updated their recommendations for our case. They suggested that Felix and I remain in foster care indefinitely, with Mom required to complete at least 2 years of intensive therapy before any consideration of reunification. Dad could potentially have supervised visitation, escalated to unsupervised if he continued making progress in therapy, but Felix and I would have input into whether we wanted that relationship. Mom's sentencing was devastating for our family in complicated ways. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation. He told her directly that she'd tortured her child while claiming to help, that she'd ignored medical professionals who tried to intervene, and that her complete lack of remorse or understanding even during trial demonstrated she remained a danger. He said that parents who genuinely harmed children while believing they were helping were still dangerous because sincere wrong belief didn't prevent real damage. Felix and I testified during the sentencing phase about the impact of Mom's actions. I described the terror of not being able to breathe while my mother insisted I was faking, the months of forced peanut consumption despite increasing reactions, the feeling of betrayal when someone who should protect you deliberately causes harm. Felix described his nightmares and his anguish watching me nearly die while our mother did nothing. We both said we didn't feel safe having any relationship with her until she truly understood what she'd done wrong, which we didn't believe had happened yet. Dad attended the sentencing but didn't testify. Afterward, he approached me and Felix in the courthouse hallway, tears streaming down his face. He apologized for not protecting us, for letting his fear of conflict endanger our lives, for being the kind of father who stood by while his child was harmed. He said he understood if we never wanted to see him again, but hoped someday we might give him a chance to prove he could be better. Felix turned away without responding. I told Dad I needed time to figure out if forgiveness was possible, but I appreciated that he was at least acknowledging what he'd failed to do. The next 2 years passed in relative peace at Denise and Malcolm's house. They officially became our foster parents with intention to adopt if reunification with our bio parents didn't happen. Felix and I slowly healed from the trauma, though some effects lingered. I remained hypervigilant about food and carried my EpiPens everywhere. Felix struggled with trusting adult authority figures and had to work through anxiety about whether people would believe him when he reported problems. But we both had therapy and support, and the knowledge that we were genuinely safe in this house. Mom served her full prison sentence with minimal early release. We received occasional letters from her during those 3 years, which her therapist encouraged her to write as part of taking accountability. The early letters were still full of justifications and defenses. Later letters showed more genuine understanding of what she'd done, and acknowledgement of the harm caused. By the 3rd year, her letters included real apologies without qualifications or explanations. Felix never read them. I read every one, watching her slow evolution towards something resembling true remorse. Dad maintained supervised visits that slowly increased in frequency and duration, as he proved himself capable of prioritizing our safety over conflict avoidance. He completed his therapy requirements and took parenting classes focused on recognizing and responding to medical needs. His relationship with Felix remained damaged and distant. Felix was civil during visits but never warm, maintaining emotional walls that Dad couldn't penetrate. My relationship with Dad improved incrementally, though it would never be what it could have been if he'd protected us when we needed him. When I turned 16, the court allowed me to make decisions about future contact with both parents. I chose to maintain limited relationship with Dad, who'd proven through years of consistent effort that he'd genuinely changed his passive patterns. I declined any contact with Mom, even though she'd been released from prison and completed extensive therapy. Her letters suggested she understood what she'd done, but I wasn't ready to face her yet. Possibly ever. The trauma of being deliberately poisoned by your mother while she convinced herself she was helping doesn't heal easily or completely. Felix made the same choice when he turned 14. He wanted nothing to do with either parent, viewing Dad's passivity as equally unforgivable as Mom's act of harm. He legally changed his last name to match Denise and Malcolm when they adopted him at 15. I kept my original name but understood his need to separate himself completely from people who'd failed to protect him. We both knew that biological family wasn't the same as chosen family, and sometimes the people who birthed you were less important than the people who kept you safe. Years later, I work as a patient advocate helping families navigate medical systems and recognize signs of medical neglect. I specialize in cases where parents refuse evidence-based medical care based on alternative theories or online misinformation. I teach workshops for doctors and teachers about identifying and reporting medical neglect before it escalates to life-threatening situations. Felix became a social worker focused on protecting children in dangerous home situations. We both turned our trauma into purpose, ensuring other kids didn't suffer what we'd endured. Mom's letters still arrive occasionally, full of apologies and requests to meet. They remain unanswered in a drawer with all the others. Some fractures can't be mended, and some relationships aren't worth rebuilding no matter how much someone claims they've changed. We survived because Felix ran for help when adults failed us, and that 8-year-old's courage remains the most profound act of love I've ever witnessed. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.